Those blue-green algae blooms, the pictures that you've seen where certain embayments look like chunky pea soup, that's outrageous. That shouldn't exist, and that means, that's an indicator of a gross failure.
This is a good bill, and I'm pleased to sign it.
Well, I think Americans would be stunned to learn that this policy, by the time we get to 2030, could cost as much as $1 trillion. Ethanol and the ethanol mandate was supposed to create a very large renewable source of energy that could replace oil, gas, fossil fuels, and help reduce greenhouse gases.
This country for a long time has been looking for energy independent solutions, and this was billed as one of them.
It was a win-win. It looked like good policy and good politics. I was involved in Vice President Gore's campaign, Senator Kerry's campaign for the presidency in 2000-2004, and in both of those campaigns we were for the ethanol mandate, we were for ethanol. It looked like it was very popular in Iowa, so it was good politically, and it looked like it was really good for the environment. Instead, we now know that's all changed. It can raise the average family's food bill by $2,000 a year.
We talk a lot in our political rhetoric about trying to make things easier for the little guy, trying to make things easier for working families, trying to be in the business of helping those people. I don't see how a policy that is increasing a food bill annually is actually a sensible policy that marries up with that rhetoric.
In terms of its impact on the engines of cars and other vehicles, you get less power out of it than you do out of a regular gallon of gasoline, so you have to use more of it.
If you get too much ethanol in your fuel tank, it can do real engine damage.
Iowa is the first caucus. It's the first event of the presidential cycle. It's predicted the Democratic nominee every time except one since 1980. It's a pretty powerful predictor of who's going to be the nominee. The amount of money spent there on the campaign is enormous. I think Iowa, in many ways, by the way, is a really good place to start this process. It demands that you go out, that you meet people. It's very personal. Its deleterious effect now is in the form of the ethanol mandate. I mean, 12 years ago, 14 years ago, it wasn't this $4 billion industry.
You obviously do have a lot of political pressure coming from the corn lobby, essentially, in Iowa to try to propel this thing forward.
If you have a $4 billion industry now that's consuming 47% of all the corn grown in Iowa and raising the price of corn, you're obviously going to have a lot of pressure, not just from organized lobbies, but from individual citizens who think they have a stake in this.
Certainly, if you go to the Iowa State Fair, where a lot of candidates come and campaign and you do the sort of soapbox thing, you will notice that basically the ethanol lobby has got all of their stuff set up literally right by the soapbox. This policy was put in place for some reasons that on the face of them look pretty good from a substantive perspective. We're not entirely political, but the fact of the matter is it's not working. It's not delivering what was promised.
So if you want to stand up and fight for working families, if you want to protect the environment, if you want to take action against climate change, then you ought to oppose the ethanol mandate.
Here's something to think about. At least half the oxygen that we breathe comes from tiny organisms that live in the ocean. These microscopic marine phytoplankton produce oxygen just like land plants. But phytoplankton are not plants. They're protists, single-celled organisms. They're so small that thousands of them can snuggle together in a single drop of water. To study phytoplankton, scientists can use microscopes up close or satellites far above. From space, you and I would see Earth like this. But some satellites see Earth like this, a dance of rainbow colors. In this case, the colors represent the concentration of phytoplankton in the ocean. Red is high concentration, blue is low. To grow and reproduce, phytoplankton depend on nutrients in the water of proper temperature and just the right light conditions. Coastal areas are extremely rich in nutrients that have washed off the land, into the rivers, and down to the sea. Areas of open ocean have lower concentrations of phytoplankton because fewer nutrients can be found there. The mouth of the Mississippi River is a perfect example of how nutrient runoff creates phytoplankton blooms. 41% of the United States drains into the Mississippi River, then out into the Gulf of Mexico. That's a total of 3.2 million square kilometers of land, or about 600 million football fields. About 12 million people live in urban areas that border the Mississippi. All those folks constantly discharge treated sewage into the rivers. However, the majority of the land in the Mississippi's watershed is farmland. Each spring, as farmers fertilize their lands, preparing for crop season, rain washes fertilizer off the land and ultimately down into the ocean. All the urban and farm discharges include nutrients, such as nitrogen and phosphorus, that are very important for the growth of phytoplankton. Incredibly, about 1.7 million tons of these nutrients are dumped into the Gulf of Mexico every year. Once the Gulf receives this huge influx of yummy nourishment, massive phytoplankton blooms occur. Now, these blooms often result in an area called the dead zone. It's actually a place where the concentration of oxygen has dropped so low that few organisms can survive there. But how does this make sense? If phytoplankton blooms produce oxygen, then why does a dead zone occur? For animals such as microscopic zooplankton and fish, phytoplankton blooms are like an all-you-can-eat buffet. Small animals eat the phytoplankton and, in turn, are eaten by bigger fish. All along, these animals are releasing waste, which falls to the bottom of the Gulf. There, bacteria are lurking, waiting to decompose the waste. In the process, they use up the oxygen, creating hypoxic conditions. The different densities of fresh water from the Mississippi and salt water from the Gulf create barriers that prevent mixing between the surface and the deep waters. Soon, there's not enough oxygen for other organisms to use. The dead zone has come. But it doesn't stay dead. The cycle of seasons restores the waters. As summer turns to fall, winds make waves, which stir up the water, allowing the layers to mix and replenishing the oxygen. Eventually, the Gulf and its fish populations return to normal.
From Cleveland's doorstep, Lake Erie stretches out and covers 10,000 square miles. It's estimated that 3 million tons of assorted debris are dumped into Lake Erie each day. Experts say that if something isn't done, the lake could die in 10 to 15 years.
In 1970, Lake Erie was in fact declared dead. Algal blooms generated by sewage and pollution from industrial waste had killed much of the lake's aquatic life. That same year, when the adjoining Cuyahoga River infamously caught fire, the so-called Dead Lake and the Burning River became poster children for the environmental movement that established the EPA and the Clean Water Act.
I saw it as a beautiful lake as a little boy. Then in the 60s, I saw it turn into what was called the dead lake. And then I've seen it clean up to just a pristine, beautiful lake.
Over the years, charter boat captain Rick Unger and those along Lake Erie's shores have witnessed the evolution of the lake. Its comeback after the Clean Water Act was widely celebrated, and by the 1980s, the most productive fishery of the Great Lakes was once again attracting tourists and fishermen alike.
I grew up on this lake. My dad was a fisherman, and he passed that tradition down to me. So I'd say I've been fishing on this lake for 52 or 53 years. We've seen this lake when it was bad, and we're not just going to sit by and let it go bad again. We're going to do everything we can to make sure this lake survives.
By 2000, Lake Erie's pollution problems were thought to be a thing of the past, but recently a new threat has emerged.
This is Lake Erie in October in 2011, and the water is totally green with algae.
Looks like we're actually driving through paint. I mean, it's so thick. That is a lot of algae.
The problem started coming back about 2000, 2002. It has accelerated, and the bloom that we saw in 2011 was 2.5 times worse than any of the blooms that we saw back in the 1960s and the 70s.
Dr. Jeff Reuter has been researching harmful algal blooms on Lake Erie for over 40 years.
Lake Erie is the southernmost, the shallowest, the warmest of the Great Lakes. It receives the most nutrients, so biologically it's the most productive of the Great Lakes. But it's possible to have too much of a good thing.
Nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus found in sewage and fertilizer overfeed the algae, and the lake, made warmer from climate change, provides a comfortable environment for the algae to thrive.
Well, when you put nutrients into water, it responds very much the same way as putting fertilizers onto our lawn. It makes the grass grow. When we put nutrients into the lake in the summer, when it's very warm, would be when you would expect to get blue-greens or cyanobacteria, and they are capable of producing toxins that can harm people, harm animals. We've had the harmful algal bloom issue on Lake Erie since the 1960s. When we solved the problem the first time, the primary source of nutrients was poor sewage treatment. So we solved the problem by greatly improving sewage treatment. Today, the primary source is agricultural runoff. Phosphorus and the nutrients in general are coming from fertilizers applied to the land or manure from an animal operation.
Corn, soybeans, and wheat are all users of phosphate, so we have to have it. If we would stop applying phosphate at all to our soils, it would be a real drag on our farm's ability to grow crops. We can get phosphate from different forms, but the most popular form is dry fertilizer that we apply to our field.
Today, farmers like Terry McClure are using a fraction of the phosphate that the agricultural industry used in the 1970s, but in the past several years, a mysterious, more potent form of phosphorus has been running off farm fields. On his 5th-generation farm, McClure has added a new piece of equipment to determine the cause.
You see behind us the 2 collection systems for collecting the water that's coming off of this field.
This self-automated sampling gear at the edge of Terry McClure's wheat field periodically samples surface and subsurface runoff, which partners at Ohio State University will test to determine precisely how much nutrient runoff the field is producing before it makes its way into the lake.
The idea is to figure out how the dissolved reactive phosphorus is leaving the land by measuring at the edge of the field. That's the research that's never been done. We want to know what farming practices will tend to keep the phosphorus on the land.
Agriculture is trying to be proactive, but it's really an all-hands-on-deck issue. This is everyone's issue.
Although agricultural runoff bears the brunt of criticism, cities, with their concrete, green lawns, and larger populations, create their own perfect storm of nutrient runoff.
During a storm event, many of our sewage treatment plants have what we call a combined sewer overflow, where the volume of water entering the plant exceeds the plant's capacity. And in those situations, the sewage literally enters the lake untreated with lots of nutrients attached to it.
Throughout the city of Wooster, Ohio, scientists have devised a relatively simple solution to the city's runoff problem.
I'm sitting here in a biphasic bioretention system, which is commonly called a rain garden. What it is basically using nature's principles to help us clean the water. We have results that show 100% removal of nitrates and phosphates.
Back on his boat, Rick Unger conducts water quality tests to support Dr. Reuter's research.
Let's see what it looks like. It's perfectly clear. Today we've got a very clean lake.
I'm pretty optimistic that we're going to be able to solve this problem within a few years. While the problem's not solved, the future looks bright.
Beginning about 10 years ago, those algae blooms turned into potentially toxic blue-green algae blooms.
And those blue-green algae blooms can seed blue-green algae blooms, these toxic blooms, elsewhere throughout the lake. So if you get it in one spot, it can tend to spread.
Blue-green algae is a threat everywhere. Everybody's involved in this. Everybody's got to start paying attention.
Over the past few decades, beach closures have become a common event. The lake was included in a travel book titled Don't Go There, and deaths of family dogs have been traced to the consumption of blue-green algae.
One beach closure is one beach closure too many. Once enough of us experience a beach closure, or our kids coming out with their skin irritated, or our dog dies because of eating blue-green algae, well then, more people will mobilize. And we live in a state that has this reputation for being an environmental leader. Why is there one dog dying?
The Bay Park, which is right over here behind us, used to average about 55,000 visitors per year, per summer season. And recently, in the past 5 to 6 years, it's averaged 5,000 visitors a year. So you can see what it was like and what it is like now.
I can tell you that Lake Champlain, for myself and my family, it is the place where we go to have fun. It's where my kids want to go swimming. It's the place where my kids couldn't go swimming this year because of a big blue-green algae outbreak down here in Ferrisburg.
The problem in the simplest form is that there's too much fertilizer getting into the lake, and that fertilizer typically is in the form of phosphorus.
So when you add phosphorus to the mix, and too much of it in a water body, and Lake Champlain certainly is one of those water bodies, you set off a whole chain reaction that interferes with the ecology, but it also interferes with human health impacts, potentially in the drinking water supply. 200,000 people drink the water out of Lake Champlain.
You can literally, in a rainstorm, watch the manure next to the barn where it's spilled next to the spreader, go right into the ditch on the side of the road, and then get conveyed right into the local creek, 200 feet down the road, go right in the river, and then go right into the lake. You can literally pinpoint where those nutrients are entering the river, making it unswimmable throughout the summer.
The regulations regarding agriculture are clearly inadequate, and in addition, the model of agriculture here, of dairy farming here, is really inconsistent with a clean lake.
Vermont dairies of the sort of the old model, the big, what they call input intensive operations that also rely on large herd sizes, large production levels, and a lot of capital investment. Those farms are not competing successfully in the global marketplace.
The model is more cows, more corn, more debt. So every time they get into trouble, we're adding cows, we're adding corn, and we're putting more land into production.
There's obviously a lot of erosion that can occur from about this time of year in the fall when the corn crop is taken off and before new vegetation comes up in the spring. Soil is sitting completely exposed for upwards of 6 months, and we believe that to be one of the most significant sources of phosphorus from the ag setting.
I think what's happening in Vermont right now is that there's a lot of feed being imported because either there's not enough crops, but most likely there are too many cows. So you need to import feed. The manure stays and is spread, and when you have too much to spread, sure enough, it will leach to the lake.
In the course of 1 week this summer, a particular farmer spread 1.2 million gallons of manure in 1 week on a field that is fairly close by, that sits on a peninsula. And it is just a industrialized waste reduction removal system.
So you need to come to a watershed phosphorus balance, a neutral balance, where for every truckload of feed coming in, you need a truckload of manure to go out. Not the same truck, by the way. Use a different truck.
Agriculture is an important part of Vermont's history, and it's an important part of our landscape aesthetic. And so while the environmental interests are pushing us in one direction, there are also other interests that say, but we like the way things look. The green farm fields and the red barns and the cows out on grass. And admittedly, some of our challenges are that we've moved away from that a little bit, that we have cows in barns and fields of corn.
Listen to any politician that's running for office. They will talk about saving the farms and supporting the farms. And they are all playing on this mythology, I like to call it the mythology of dairy in Vermont.
Agriculture is 1.5% of our gross state product, employs less than 3% of our population.
If you're not a blood relative of the person who owns the farm, there are no good jobs on the farm, all right? There ain't any.
The messengers will get attacked for being anti-agriculture. We're not anti-agriculture, we're anti-pollution.
Milk is a commodity. What does that mean? It means whether you produce it for $10 or whether you produce it for $6, you still get the same price.
In Vermont, in 2009, we saw subsidies on the order of $25 million. These payments to subsidize a commodity production far outpace money that's spent on any funds at all that are tied to environmental performance of our dairy farms.
You're up against a huge problem with a commodity system here. And that drives farmers to try and find the cheapest way to solve their problems. That means they have 25 things to do that day. In their mind, one of it is making sure that their nutrient management is handled effectively.
What we need to focus on is how do we get a better price for our product. That's the big issue. We're not fairly compensated for what we're doing. And we don't like to be subsidized to make that happen. I mean, when you get up in the morning, and I talk to a lot of my neighbors, they get up at 4 o'clock and they work until dark and they borrow money to do that. It's pretty hard to get motivated to start looking at a potential water quality issue when you can't even feed your kids.
Part of where Vermont has failed those farms is in giving them the impression that they can continue to operate with a subsidy in the form of pollution, allowing them to pollute the waters of the state, to deplete our soil resources, to farm right up to the edge of rivers and destroy riparian corridors, that's okay in some way, and it's not.
So what is Vermont doing to regulate the flow of phosphorus into Lake Champlain?
I call it the $100 million question. So over the last 7 years, we've invested upwards of $100 million between state and federal resources. Clean and Clear is a broad-based water quality initiative. We have grant funds that we put out each year in an effort to help support good projects to improve water quality. The fact of the matter is that there's still algae blooms, and I know that really it's frustrating to people. It's frustrating to the folks here at the agency as well.
There are a lot of things that we're doing that really have very little to do with reducing pollution going down to Lake Champlain. They make us feel good, but they're not really addressing the problem. We know there are some places across the landscape that produce more runoff than others simply because of where they are, the kind of soils they have, the way the land is being used. And if we targeted those places, we could make a lot of progress faster.
One of the things that the legislature did a few years ago was to ask for a program audit of the Clean and Clear program. We asked for that audit because we wanted to know that those millions of dollars were being used effectively. And what we found was that they weren't. We found that the program was disconnected. We found that the goals were not set and the standards not set adequately, and that places like agriculture and land use, urban development, weren't targeted appropriately for the help that they needed.
Nobody likes to point fingers at American farmers.
Agriculture's had a real wide berth in America for a lot of years, but things have changed.
Nor has it ever been popular to single out excessive fertilizer use as the main cause for Lake Erie's algal woes. But today's agricultural practices leave little doubt and few choices for the farmer.
The strength of fertilizers, the application rates, the need to turn crops over faster or more crops in a year, all require real aggressive positions for farmers.
This is Quasar Energy's founder and president, Mel Kurtz.
And the result sometimes is a compromise in the environment.
Mel comes from a long line of Kurtzes who know a thing or two about keeping soil fertile.
For years, the family operated the Akron compost facility, and the responsibility was to take all of their sewage sludge solids and convert them to compost.
So he understands all too well the nexus between food production and lake health.
People call it nutrient management. Most of us call it nutrient mismanagement. Phosphorus and nitrogen are what feed the algae in these lakes. So you add sun to the plant life that's already in the lakes or streams with nutrient-rich phosphorus and nitrogen, voila, we have lakes you can't use. We have lakes with toxic algae that kill animals, fish, and are harmful to humans.
But for him, fertilizer and stormwater management are surface problems. At the root of it all is the lack of alternatives for those actually getting their hands dirty.
If you tell a farmer you can't use phosphorus because there's going to be runoff and you have no proposed alternative, what's he do? Okay, so he stops growing his crops and we stop eating. That doesn't work so well.
Behind Mel is his alternative. A solution not only for farmers and cleaning up Lake Erie, but an answer for sustainable energy and controlling greenhouse gas emissions. It's called an anaerobic biodigester.
It's like a cow's stomach.
This is Quasar's plant operator, James Robinson. James alone runs the bioenergy plant here in East Cleveland.
We take in organic waste and we run it through a process of anaerobic digestion to create methane gas. And the methane gas is then used to create electricity and also power vehicles.
Up to 250 homes get their electricity from the methane created by bacteria as it devours all the waste that we'd normally shove down a trash compactor, flush away, or dump in a landfill.
It could be byproducts from food manufacturing, it could be manure from farms, it could be fat soils and grease, sewage sludge, municipal waste streams, could be from baseball parks, football stadiums.
In fact, this tanker is offloading grease waste from a couple of well-known big box stores. But electricity and CNG is only part of the story. What the bacteria can't convert into methane gas gets processed into fertilizer. Fertilizer without phosphorus, a key ingredient of harmful algae blooms.
We've been working on for over a year to separate the phosphorus from the liquid stream that allows us to take the phosphorus where we need it and stop putting it on where we don't need it.
Along with conservation and restoration programs, farmers now have another tool to combat algae-feeding runoff.
The cow eats the grain, the manure comes to the digester, the food came from the cow, and now we're going back to digesting it, and the nutrients that went through the cycle already is going to return to that cycle again.
From fertilizer to food to waste and back to fertilizer again. All in one perfectly sustainable loop. A possible solution for America's growing need for more energy, fresh water, and food.
Every time you fill up the tank, the price of petrol seems to have gone up. The problem is, there's only so much oil, and demand is growing at an alarming rate. Not long ago, President Bush said the US was addicted to oil. And that's true of every developed country. We desperately need viable alternative fuel sources. But what most countries are still pondering, Sweden is putting into practice. And the whole world is watching Linköping, a city of 100,000 south of Stockholm, where an energy revolution is taking place. The locals care less about the rising cost of oil and more about cowpat production, splot. Because most of the town's buses, taxis, even the train, run on a methane-rich clean fuel created from very smelly waste like this. One of the reasons Linköping started this experiment is that this lovely old town absolutely stank of diesel. Methane is a clean-burning fuel and has no odour whatsoever. In fact, like natural gas, they choose to add a slight smell so you can tell if there's a leak. Linköping started producing biogas 15 years ago. Since then, the town has never looked or smelled better. Carl Lillehook runs his car on methane-rich biogas and commutes to work on a biogas-powered bus. Hey, Carl.
Hello.
So, this is a biogas bus.
Yes, it's comfortable and clean, so it's perfect to go on the bus in Linköping.
Unlike fossil fuels like petrol and diesel, biogas has very low emissions, adds no carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, is renewable and can be produced locally. And it's up to 30% cheaper than petrol at the pump. How do the emissions coming out of this bus compare to a petrol or diesel vehicle?
There are no emissions coming out from this bus. It's totally clean.
All the city's 70 buses use biogas, reducing carbon dioxide emissions by 90%. The gas is piped underground to a refuelling depot, which can refuel 60 buses at a time. Taxis have dual fuel systems, biogas and petrol. They can also run on natural gas if cow dung production takes a nosedive. Linköping's train is also the world's first to, you guessed it, be powered by biogas. Twin diesels have been replaced by gas engines. While it's not clear how many cowpats to the kilometre or mile it gets, it has a top speed of 130 kilometres per hour, carries 54 passengers with a range of 600 kilometres or 360 miles. Whether it's for trains, cars or buses, the beauty of biogas is it doesn't have to be shipped in a tanker all the way from the Middle East. It's made locally. All the raw ingredients can be found inside this building. When they first started producing biogas here 10 years ago, the mix contained 50% that stuff, manure. Today, a higher percentage of slaughterhouse and industrial food waste is used because protein and fat provides more energy per kilo. Don't be scared. Linköping's biogas plant uses about 100,000 tonnes of organic waste per year, all gathered locally. 10 years ago, it was literally going to waste. Now, it's creating a sustainable energy source. The plant works like a mechanical swamp, producing methane, also known as marsh gas, by starving the waste matter of oxygen. The organic waste material is brought to this plant by truck. Most of it is unloaded into this trap, then it's mixed with water and turned into a nice slurry. All that is then blended together in this reception tank, and it turns into a horrid, homogeneous sludge. Oh, yuck. It smells really bad. Next, it's cleaned by steam heating it to above 70 degrees Celsius for at least an hour. This kills all the dangerous bacteria. After it's cooled, it's pumped into 2 big digester tanks. And this is like a natural swamp. The temperature is kept at about 38 degrees Celsius and there's no oxygen. The perfect environment for all the different microorganisms to do their work. They break down the material and they produce the gas. The whole process, turning a warm soup of organic waste into an energy-rich fuel, takes about a month. The finished product, filling this tanker, is about 97% methane. The plant produces 300,000 cubic metres of gas a month. 1 cubic metre of biogas has the same energy as a litre of petrol or diesel.
Biogas isn't the only thing produced. The material left over after digestion makes an excellent biofertiliser, and it's sold to 35 farms in the area.
Completing Linköping's inspiring alternative energy cycle, the fertiliser is returned to the farms that provided the raw material, using the biogas-powered train. While Linköping is leading the way towards an oil-free future, other centres are fast catching on.
Could this be done in all the towns in Sweden?
Definitely. And I think about 10 cities today is doing it in Sweden. And it's no problem to do it in all of them. That's just using the biogas they already have in the town.
Companies like Volvo are already selling biogas cars straight from the showroom. And if Swedish motorists needed an added incentive, they've got it. No fuel tax, no road tolls, and free parking in council car parks. Now, this isn't the total solution to the coming oil crisis, but it's a great start. So have a think about the city you're living in. Do you reckon it could do with a dose of Linköping-inspired energy? I suspect so.
In 2007, Congress passed an expanded Renewable Fuel Standard, or RFS, which mandates that large quantities of biofuel, made from corn and other biomass, be blended into the fuel supply each year. Lawmakers promised that this policy of turning food and plants into fuel would be a silver bullet for America's energy challenges, making us more energy secure and more environmentally friendly. Sounds too good to be true? Well, it is. 7 years later, the RFS has not only failed to achieve its stated objectives, it's also hurting every American at the grocery store and the gas station. Let's take a look at the quote-unquote success of the RFS so far. What does energy security look like under the RFS? Not much. Ethanol distorts energy markets, and the government's own Energy Information Administration projects that the U.S. will still rely on oil and natural gas products for more than half of its energy needs for decades to come. Ethanol could also increase fuel costs. Experts have said that RFS mandates are likely to increase ethanol prices by 18.8%. Raising the cost of gasoline, which is required to be blended with ethanol. In fact, fuel that is up to 85% ethanol is more expensive than pure gasoline, even with today's petroleum prices, and biodiesel costs more than $1.50 more per gallon to produce. Restricting Americans' access to affordable fuel is a strange approach to energy security, don't you think? Well, that's a shame, but at least we're lowering emissions, right? Wrong. In order to produce enough biofuel to power the more than 250 million registered vehicles in America, an unprecedented amount of land must be cultivated. Since 2005, we have more than doubled the amount of land for biofuels, currently using 8.5% of all U.S. farmland, a number that could double again in the next 10 years. So where are we getting this land from? The clearing of natural forests and grasslands to make room for corn. Researchers have found that this deforestation actually doubles greenhouse gas emissions over 30 years. So the RFS is not only failing to meet its intended goals, it's actually working against them. But the lunacy doesn't stop there. The RFS raises costs for every family in America. During the worst drought the United States has seen since 1956, the mandate diverts 40% of America's corn crop away from food and animal feed to ethanol production for fuel. Skyrocketing animal feed costs have put a strain on livestock farmers and pushed food prices higher and higher. Put simply, more ethanol means less food and higher prices. Since the RFS passed in 2005, the price of corn increased more than 200%. Cereal and bakery product prices have increased almost 77%. Meat, poultry, fish, and egg prices have increased 78%. Vegetable oil and fats like butter are up more than 444%. In short, breakfast just is not what it used to be. Neither is what you put in your gas tank. Beyond making gasoline more expensive, ethanol is also 33% less efficient than traditional gasoline. The lower fuel economy of ethanol gasoline blends means Americans will spend a lot more time and money at the pump. The renewable fuel standard has failed to meet its goals over 5 years. Instead, it's costing Americans money, hurting the environment, and failing to limit our dependence on foreign energy sources. So ask yourself a question. Why is this still the law of the land? Call on lawmakers to reform the failed renewable fuel standard. Pledge your support for a smarter way forward, a smarter fuel future.